To be slightly more specific about Marx's vision, Marxism proposes that all conflicts in human history are fundamentally economic and persist between a owner class and a working class, which can be easily identified at any period of history. This struggle between worker and ruling classes has driven all major transformation in our civilization and in the human race generally, creating a pattern of history that can be easily modeled and easily predicted in a scientific, materialist fashion. Here, Marx explicitly introduces 3 stages of history that one can broadly suss out using his dialectic materialist theory. The first stage, feudalism, under which most post-Iron Age but primitive societies function under, is one in which military rulers control the means of production, and serfs or peasants, or in some cases even slaves, work as properties of the feudal class. Class distinctions are solid, unmoving, and materials are exchanged directly, starting from the peasants that produce them, grow them, or mine them, and going directly to the feudal lords, which extract them as taxes or as booty. Once more, the peasant, serf, or slave has no choice in the matter. They are merely a function of the system, and in many ways they could be considered the feudal lord's property, although there is some key distinction between serfdom and slavery. Moving forward, Marx's dialectic materialist history showed a transformation from feudalism to something that Marx called capitalism, in which the feudal class was replaced by a class of bankers and industrialists. Here, trade was the dominant mechanism, and the power over the means of production was procured through investment finance. The people who owned the means of production were characterized not by means of birth, but just by the virtue that they owned the means of production, that they had come into possession of them. And this created an implicit class division between them and the working class, which was, under Marx's reading, getting worse and worse and worse as time went on. And here, Marx envisioned a third transformation, a move towards socialism, vaguely described, a system of equality where the workers would own the means of production, which of course would be brought about dialectically when capitalist power had gotten so self-contradictory and so large that revolution was the only option left to the people who were forced to sell their labor in the open market. And this 3-stage view of history is in essence the main contribution of Marxism and communism. It is the main result of applying dialectic materialism to our understanding of human relations in history, and immediately we see problems. In many ways, Marx has doubled down on enlightenment over confidence. He describes human transformations, events in the future, as if he's witnessing them in the past, as if he's looking at the transformation from capitalism to socialism as if it's already happened. This is a fatal conceit that I think is highly troubling for Marx's pretension to be scientific in his appraisal of human history, a title that Marxists are very wont to obtain, even though they deny it when called out on this bullshit. But more than just the standard enlightenment over confidence, I think this narrative of history provides a more fundamental problem, a problem that naturally leads it into making mistakes about human nature, and a problem that causes the followers of Marxism to continue making the same mistakes 150 years after their originator is dead and buried in the ground. And unfortunately, this problem is directly linked to what makes Marxism so seductive, what makes Marxism so appealing to younger idealistic thinkers. And this is the fundamental narrative and eschatological nature to this concept of history. There is a seductive, progressive pattern to this. Oftentimes we think of Marxists being fundamentally anti-capitalist, but the real villain in this picture of history, the real baddie that we are trying to overcome and get away from, is feudalism, the first stage. Now, by the time that Marx had become popular, the last vestiges of feudalism, and certainly feudal economies, were being washed away, were being eroded at ever faster and faster speed. In criticizing feudalism as being backwards and ineffective, Marx was more or less flogging a dead horse, and he knew that. But I think in a critical move of ingenious marketing, Marx realized that he could tell the same narrative about the corporatist system that was coming to replace the feudal system. That it too would be washed away by the revolutions that were rocking the monarchies of Europe, as he wrote. Moreover, since the French Revolution had demonstrated that no contrived societies developed in the wake of revolutions would necessarily be good and just, Marx was free to substitute in the result of this second-order revolution, the revolution against the corporate structure, as the means to an end that really would be truly good, just, and even utopian. Socialism, in Marx's view, the ultimate end of human organization, was nothing less than scientifically organized humanity, the dream of the French Revolution, but this time for real. It was, for lack of a better word, utopian. And I know modern Marxists shy away from the word because, well, they know they have to. But as vaguely as Marx describes communism or socialism, it is obvious that he has a very utopian vision of what this will entail when it comes to fruition. He talks about a world completely devoid of any scarcity, want, or competition, where human beings are free to hunt and fish in the morning, farm in the evening, and philosophize and do literary criticism at night. This, I think, is more akin to a vision of a land of milk and honey than it is any realistic description of an actual form of human organization. But we see here that this three-part stage of humanity is very, very seductive, very, very simple. There is the bad old system of despotism and monarchy, followed by the middle system of capitalism, followed by the ultimate utopian system of socialism. We are inevitably on the path to the perfect society, and the Enlightenment ideas will bring us there, as long as we follow Karl Marx, that is. But before I go too far afield on this, I want to point out one interesting thing when it comes to analyzing the original subject of this video, the word capitalism. Because in all of this Marxist grand narrative, capitalism plays a very, very strange role. As we see from the simplified diagram, it is in fact a middle stage between a system that was entirely bad and some future system that will be entirely good. And in this way, capitalism is more or less just seen as a middle period, a transitory stage, not really any specific mode of operation in humanity, just the waiting room before we enter the utopian vision of socialism that Marx promises. Although Marx does make some fair observations about markets and places, we will see that the role of capitalism is really much more elusive and vague. As Marx's theory develops, it is little more than an obstacle to socialism, something that stands in the way, something that holds humanity back. And as Marx's theory developed, both through the later careers of Marx and Engels, and also later Marxist philosophers that came after them, the role of capitalism grew larger and larger as a catch-all explanation for any and all human misery. Capitalism was the reason for our alienation from the means of production. Capitalism was the reason for our psychological problems, our problems with spirituality and the family, our problems relating to our fellow man. If capitalism could be removed or mitigated or destroyed, all of these problems, like the capitalist ownership class itself, would simply fade away, would simply no longer be issues. I would propose here that as much as Marxists talk about capitalism, the word to them really doesn't have very many qualities. It is only a placeholder, a middle stage between two things. A sort of Nietzschean tightrope, if you will. Now, of course, I understand that if a Marxist were here, he would probably say something like, well, the transition from feudalism to capitalism is something that we can definitively observe. And in fact, Distributist, didn't you point out some similar revolution at the beginning of this video? That's what we mean by capitalism. And sure enough, we can see a certain type of economic revolution. As I've mentioned, there was both the market revolution and the industrial and corporate revolutions. These did mark a type of transition away from feudal organization, albeit gradually. But I think that this transformation, this institution, is quite definitively not what Marxists mean by capitalism. They mean something much more vague. And I think we can see this not by comparing capitalism to what came before, but by comparing what differentiates what Marxists believe to be capitalism from what Marxists believe to be socialism. When Marxists say that they want to have socialism replace capitalism, do they actually mean they want to have one form of real human economic organization replace our current one? Or do they simply mean they want a utopian eschaton, and they want to tear down whatever and whoever they think vaguely stands in the way of this utopian eschaton? If they're interested in procuring a real economic system, it shouldn't be hard to describe that system. But I've noticed something strange when I've asked Marxists about what socialism entails and how it's different from our present system. There don't appear to be any really good answers. The first and most common answer I get when I ask Marxists what defines socialism is that it's fundamentally post-scarcity. There is no scarcity, there is no want. We have the ability to produce as many resources as we need to have society thrive. This goes a long way to explaining how Marx so flippantly describes the removal of division of labor, one of the most fundamental organizing principles of human society since the Iron Age. Marx is assuming that there will be no scarcity, that production will be in so excess of human demands that really nothing can happen organizationally to perturb that, to create genuine want. But in this answer, I just see nothing more than an intellectually dishonest cop-out. Again, I'm not asking for a description of a utopia. I'm not asking for some vision of the end times, some get out of human problems free card. I'm asking about a real economic system that you presumably want to install in place of the real present economic system. Saying that your economic system operates under conditions of post-scarcity is like saying that you have a flying machine that only operates under conditions of zero gravity. What does it even mean? Economic systems are designed to mitigate scarcity. The only reason why we even have an economic system is because of scarcity. The decisions it makes is over who gets what and how the incentives are aligned. In a situation of total non-scarcity, we're not talking about economics anymore. We're just talking about wish fulfillment. Letting a thinker talk about designing an economic system under conditions of post-scarcity is like having an engineer design energy-efficient power plants under conditions of infinite energy. The circumstances make the entire problem ridiculous to begin with. But once we remove ourselves from just the quality of post-scarcity that's supposed to necessarily inhabit the Marxist socialist utopia, other descriptors are much harder to come by. Would, for instance, socialism be totally devoid of inequality? Most Marxists historically would say yes. Under socialism and communism, all people are equal. That's implicitly what socialism and communism communicates, right? Well, perhaps. But there's a fundamental problem with equality when we talk about it realistically, and that is that it is simply unachievable. Leaving aside the fact that we say all men are created equal as a legal fiction, they most certainly are not created equal in reality. Humans are individually different, and possibly groups of humans may be different on average. Under these real circumstances of human existence, what does it even mean to have no inequality? In fact, Marx himself even partially realized that this pursuit of equality, qua equality, was meaningless. He toyed with the example of two workers who worked a different amount of time at any given task. If we compensated the two workers equally, one worker would have worked harder for the same amount of compensation. However, if we compensated them differently, one would ultimately have more resources to spend. There could not be equality in any way, shape, or form, not unless there is uniformity, both of characteristics and also of action. I notice a lot more intelligent Marxists tend to back away from talking about how inequality will be abolished under socialism. But if we agree that inequality won't be entirely abolished under socialism, all we are talking about is the transformation of one inequality under capitalism to another one under socialism, under communism. And I care very deeply about how socialism describes and justifies its own inequalities. But here, of course, the conversation comes to an end, because as much as an intelligent Marxist might admit that there will naturally be inequalities, it is verboten under Marxist theory to ever talk about them or discuss their organization in detail. That would destroy the narrative. So here we are left with a distinction that isn't a distinction, that is merely a vague emotion. And the problem persists if we vary ourselves a little bit and discuss hierarchy. Is there not going to be hierarchy under a socialist or communist system? Once more, opposing hierarchy is a staple of communist and Marxist ideas, of communist and Marxist talking points. And any ordinary communist activist you grill on the streets will certainly say that there will be no hierarchies under communism or socialism. But this again is ridiculous. Humans are naturally hierarchical. We have a need to divide labor, to gather around leaders, to have certain discrete decisions be made at certain discrete points, and that will naturally result in a hierarchy. Of course, perhaps some type of pure democracy could exist at the most localized form of human existence, the type of organization you might see in a hunter and gatherer society. But this quickly falls apart when we get to something that looks like a modern nation, let alone the world or humanity as a whole. You're not going to have 6 billion people voting in a direct democracy over every single decision everywhere. Leaders will have to be selected, those leaders will have authority, and that will implicitly create hierarchy. And how will socialism organize this hierarchy? How will socialist hierarchy be better than capitalist hierarchy? Well, crickets. Because we can't admit that socialism will have hierarchy, we can't talk about it. It's emotionally dissonant, and therefore the distinction is simply not addressed. We are assured somehow that the hierarchy under socialism will be better than the hierarchy under our present economic order, but this is merely an emotional assurance. There is no actual argument or demonstration behind it. And we disappear once more into vagaries. And this fundamental vagueness about the distinction between capitalism and socialism on the part of Marxists persists even when we talk about one thing that Marx distinctly criticized about capitalism: markets. Will socialism have markets? Will socialism use market forces to come to any sort of decisions about allocations of goods? Well, classically, Marxists would obviously say no. It has to be centrally organized, because central organization is the only way that we can have democratic input. But once more, I see modern Marxists tend to walk away from this classical notion of socialism. This is largely because there have been quite definitive economic theories developed by people like Hayek and von Mises that have pointed out the necessity of markets and market decisions to operate in order to come to some equilibrium point between incentive and desire. There may not be any way to compute the price or value of anything without a market or some system that is so similar to a market that we might as well call it a market. And this theoretical problem that von Mises and Hayek pointed out matches up very closely to real problems seen by command economies in the 20th century. There is a problem of demand and distribution, and it won't go away. This has led some socialists and some communists to talk about market socialism, or communism with some implicit controlled markets. But this only creates more confusion. What are we even talking about? What is this socialist utopia except for a promise of non-scarcity and platitudes about removing things that we can't possibly remove from human experience? We can't guarantee we're getting rid of markets, we can't guarantee we're getting rid of hierarchy, we can't guarantee we're getting rid of inequality, but we're not going to talk about how we're managing those problems. We're just going to assert that it's going to be perfect, and oh, by the way, there's not going to be any scarcity. And this is all science. But in reality, I think it's obvious that nothing rigorous has been done. Only an emotion has been expressed. And as distinct as the post-industrial corporate system is from the feudal system it replaced, we see that in its distinction from any future socialist system, it is little more than an amorphous blob, designed to fill in anything that the socialist or communist doesn't like and wants to tear down. We're not so much for any given economic system. We're not even necessarily against inequality, hierarchy, or markets. We're just against capitalist inequality, capitalist hierarchy, and capitalist markets. But to be absolutely charitable, even with this construction, we cannot completely dismiss the communist critique of our present order, of quote-unquote capitalism. After all, there could be real political objections of a much more confined order. Perhaps communists, perhaps Marxists, just want to get rid of a certain kind, a certain variety of ruler, or a certain type of market, a certain variety of hierarchical organization. Perhaps we could say that communists just want to get rid of the capitalists or the bourgeoisie, a specific class. They just want to get rid of private property, a certain kind of property, and they just want to get rid of centralization, the mode of organizing humans at a very, very high level, where direct democracy and direct accountability become impossible. And these are very, very legitimate concerns.